This is part one of my deep dive into Taylor Swift's album, The Torture Poets Department. My perspective is one of a songwriter and a former English teacher. We'll talk about what these songs are really about. Apologies in advance to Maddie Healy fans, and why I think this album has some of Taylor's best songwriting to date. But before we talk about specific songs, we have to start with the poem that Taylor includes with this album, titled In Summation. The key to understanding anything is context. In this poem, Taylor gives us the context and the background information we need to digest the songs and understand them. She talks specifically about her relationship with Joe, her relationship with Maddie, and makes it very clear that she doesn't want the audience to get it all twisted about what either of these relationships actually means to her. And that is, in a nutshell, Maddie was simply the door through which Taylor moved on from Joe. But more importantly, more important than any of these men, she makes it clear in this poem that the one thing that she values, the one thing that she'll always love and dedicate herself to, is her art. What Taylor does particularly well in her writing on this album is her use of imagery and motifs, and her ability to infuse layered meaning and illustrate complex emotions. And we'll see some of that in the poem, so let's look at it line by line. The poem can be divided into 4 sections. The first section is an introduction. Taylor writes, "At this hearing, I stand before my fellow members of the Torture Poets Department with a summary of my findings, a debrief, a detailed rewinding, for the purpose of warning, for the sake of reminding." She's saying, let me catch you up to speed and remind you of what has happened that's brought me here today. Line 6 grabs my attention with the purpose of warning. Warning about what? Let's keep that in mind and read on. Line 8. As you might all unfortunately recall, I have been struck with a case of a restricted humanity. She's saying to the audience, you remember what happened to me, and refers to a restricted humanity. She may be acknowledging how the audience has been a public witness to what we know was an intensely private period of her life, which started and ended with her 6-year relationship with Joe. Aside from this physical sense of being restricted, we've also gotten a sense of her being emotionally restricted. We've seen this on every album starting from Lover, where she continually painted this picture of being someone who was trying to change and bend themselves into what they think their partner wanted in order for the relationship to work. And toward the end of this relationship, she would describe feelings of being locked up in a prison. We'll see in a few lines that she's also alluding to something else with this mention of a restricted humanity. But for now, she goes on to say in line 11, which explains my plea here today of temporary insanity. She emphasized the word insanity. She's saying, because of that restricted humanity, I went crazy. As the audience, I have questions like, what do you mean you went crazy? She continues, line 13. You see, the pendulum swings, oh, the chaos it brings, leads the caged beast to do the most curious things. The caged beast she's referring to is herself. While Taylor does describe her relationship with very similar metaphors of being locked up or imprisoned, the cage is a specific metaphor Taylor has used to describe her life with fame. So this adds another layer of meaning, and that is her awareness of how much she's on display and poked and prodded for the entertainment of others. She actually writes a lot about this on the album. So with this in mind, we can actually go back to the restricted humanity we read about earlier and reinterpret it with this other layer of meaning about her life with fame. This reference to herself of being the caged beast also introduces what I call the third wheel of the Torture Poets Department. And the third wheel is the public. I call it the third wheel because while on the surface, most of the songs on the album involve 2 subjects, and that's Taylor herself and a romantic partner, be it Joe or Maddie or even Travis, she repeatedly mentions the public either explicitly or implicitly in these very same songs. I'll talk more about this when I go into specific songs, so for now let's get back to the poem. So with this stanza, she's explaining that the pendulum of her life swung from one extreme to another, and things got a little crazy, and the caged beast, herself, did some strange and weird things. Now we know why in line 6 she gave us the purpose of warning. She's preparing her audience for what we're about to hear on this album, because we're probably going to find some of it crazy or what we would consider out of character for her. Now we enter the second section of this poem, where she describes exactly what this pendulum swing entails. Line 17. Lovers spend years denying what's ill-fated. Fans will understand right away that she's talking about Joe. But let's take a moment to appreciate just how Taylor layers meaning into her writing, and she does that here. On the CD version of this poem, the word lovers is italicized. At face value, this line means how it reads, Lovers spend years denying what's ill-fated. But by italicizing the word lovers, which is the grammatically correct way to refer to the title of a work like a book or an album, it calls to mind Taylor's album Lover, with its lead single, Lover, which has always represented the height of her and Joe's relationship. But if you know the album beyond just the radio singles, then you probably know that there were some songs that pointed to red flags in the relationship. Taylor has now indirectly confirmed this by putting the song Lover on her 5 Stages of Heartbreak playlist that centers around denial. So all these layers work together to reinforce what she's talking about in this line, and that is, there were signs for a long time that it wasn't going to work out with her and Joe. She continues, line 18, resentment rotting away, galaxies recreated. Meaning, resentment and bitterness chipped away and slowly destroyed the wondrous and expansive world they created and lived in together. Line 20, stars placed and glued meticulously by hand next to the ceiling fan. Meaning, the hopes and dreams, the stars, that they held and planned carefully for their future never stood a chance, because next to the ceiling fan means those hopes and dreams were never safe. They were inevitably going to get blown away. Line 23, tried wishing on comets, tried dimming the shine, tried to orbit his planet. She's saying she tried everything to make it work. Dimming the shine, making herself less. Orbit his planet, make him the center of her life. She also says wishing on comets, and here we get another double meaning. At face value, wishing on comets just sounds like another way of saying wishing on stars. But comets were actually considered to be a bad omen by a lot of ancient cultures. So this adds another layer of meaning, and that is not correctly seeing the signs and having hopes for a relationship that was doomed to begin with. This again reiterates what she said earlier about denying what's ill-fated. These layers and callbacks are just fantastic. She ends this stanza with, line 26, some stars never align. That, despite all her efforts, sometimes things just don't work out. And in line 27, she tells us how she ended the relationship. And in one conversation, I tore down the whole sky. By the way, her commitment to her motif here is just stellar. Words and phrases like galaxies, stars, wishing on comets, dimming the shine, orbit his planet, stars never align, tore down the whole sky. The imagery is so strong and consistent. We'll see her do this again with this same motif in the song Down Bad, and it's just great writing. Okay, I'm going to have to do a part 2. We'll see what she goes on to say about Maddie, and it's probably not what you think. This is part 2 of my deep dive into Taylor Swift's album, The Torture Poets Department, and we're talking about the poem that she included with the album. So if you haven't watched part 1, go do that. Otherwise, let's continue with the second half. We're at line 28. Spring sprung forth with dazzling freedom hues. Taylor just told us one line earlier that she ended her long-term relationship, a relationship that was ill-fated and rotted away. Now she's showing us the contrast of her life post-breakup, where spring sprung forth and her newfound freedom brought fresh new life that was shiny and exciting. So this is the turn. This is where her pendulum swings the other way. Line 29. Then a crash from the skylight, bursting through, something old, someone hallowed, who told me he could be brand new. Of course, we know she's referring to Maddie Healy. She tells us here that there's a past with this person. He's someone who's special to her, and they have history. But the connotation is that whatever they had previously didn't go well because of the old him. Line 33. And so I was out of the oven and into the microwave, out of the slammer and into a tidal wave. This immediately brings to mind the saying, out of the frying pan and into the fire, which is used to describe a situation where, in an effort to get out of a bad situation, you actually end up in a worse one. So, if Joe is the slow suffocating heat of an oven, then Maddie is the fast scorching radiation of a microwave. If being with Joe is being locked up in a slammer, then being with Maddie is being swept up and away in a tidal wave. This is the chaos she spoke of earlier when she wrote, "The pendulum swings, oh the chaos it brings." She also wants the audience to know exactly how she saw things with Maddie. Line 36. How gallant to save the Empress from her gilded tower, swinging a sword he could barely lift. She's saying he was never up to the task. But, line 39, loneliness struck at that fateful hour, low-hanging fruit on his wine-stained lips. She's saying, I was just lonely at the time, and he was there, and he was available. He was simply a convenient, low-hanging fruit. Now, is this how you would describe someone you had meaningful or deep feelings for? This is why at the beginning of this deep dive, I apologize to Maddie fans, because the theory that Taylor and Maddie somehow shared a special love that hibernated for 10 years and they've held a candle for each other all this time to finally get the chance to bring that love to life is simply not supported by the evidence from Taylor's own words. And in case there's still any doubt, Taylor clarifies again in line 41, he never even scratched the surface of me. She's saying, whatever I had with him, whatever the connection we shared, it was not that deep. It was not that serious. And in fact, she adds, line 43, none of them did. That's right, including Joe, because he probably never fully knew or accepted the whole of Taylor. And how can you truly love someone unless you fully know them and accept them as they are? This brings us to the final section of the poem, line 44. In summation, it was not a love affair. I screamed while bringing my fists to my coffee ring desk. It was a mutual manic phase. It was self-harm. It was house and then cardiac arrest. First of all, we need to acknowledge that she is screaming while pounding her fists. But at whom? If you watch part 1 of this is what I call the third wheel of the Torture Poets department, and that is the public. She's screaming in frustration at the public, at the perception and response to her relationships. Now, this stanza is probably the most layered and interesting of this whole poem because you can interpret it in a few different ways. One interpretation, and the one that I see the most often, is that she's referring to her relationship with Maddie. But I will argue that she's actually referring to both of her relationships with Maddie and with Joe. And there are 3 clues that tell me this. The first clue is that after spending the majority of the poem talking about Joe and then Maddie individually, in line 43 she writes, none of them did, as a standalone line. To me, this is a zoom out. This is taking the audience out of looking at each of these relationships separately to looking at the bigger picture. This is reinforced by the second clue, which is Taylor starting the next line in the next section with, in summation. The word summation is a subtle yet crucial choice, because while it feels the same as the word summary, it's not quite the same. Summary deals with what's essential, while summation has to do with the total or the whole of something. So to me, she's actually saying here, when you add it all up, when you consider all these relationships, none of them was a love affair. And this actually echoes exactly what she said in the line before, that none of them scratched the surface of her. Now, I know this is a shocking thing to say about a 6-year relationship, but we can't get into that now because the Joe rabbit hole is deep. So let me just say, there were signs. The third clue pointing to the fact that she's talking about both Joe and Maddie here is that this section ends with the line that refers to the both of them. Line 49. It was house and then cardiac arrest, meaning it was house arrest with Joe and then cardiac arrest with Maddie. So this whole stanza begins and ends with Taylor talking about both men. It naturally makes sense then that the middle is about them too. Now, it's easy to see how mutual manic phase and self-harm may relate to her relationship with Maddie, but when you think about it, it's actually quite fitting to describe her relationship with Joe this way as well. If we go back to the Reputation album, which details the very beginning of their relationship, we can see Taylor writing a lot about how fast and hard she felt for Joe, how infatuated she was, and how passionate they were with each other. If we look at the whole arc of their relationship through the lens of her music, we see that the later albums were pretty bleak and depressive, which makes the beginning years of their relationship manic by contrast. As for self-harm, starting from the Lover album, Taylor's songwriting frequently contained themes of betrayal, emotional insecurity, and relationship turmoil. I would say it was a 4-album documentary of the slow decay of her relationship with Joe. And for her to have gone back and tried time and again to salvage things, I can see how in hindsight she might reflect upon those years and say so much of that pain was self-inflicted. So now that Taylor has established with the audience where she stands with these relationships, she ends the poem by turning the attention to herself. Line 50. A smirk creeps onto this poet's face, because it's the worst men that I write best. With this smirk, she is letting the audience know that despite all that's happened with her relationships, she will be okay. And that all the ups and downs and chaos she's experienced with these men will simply be fuel for her art. That by channeling all her feelings into her writing in order to process them, it will only make her better at her craft and ultimately yield great songs. She reiterates this in the next stanza, line 52. And so I enter into evidence my tarnished coat of arms, my muses acquired like bruises, my talismans and charms, the tick, tick, tick of love bombs, my veins of pitch black ink. She's now presenting her songs to us, saying, here they are. These are all my experiences and stories. Be they good or bad, the one thing that I did, the one thing I will continue to do, is right. This last line carries extra weight for me as a songwriter because in songwriting there's a saying, bleed on the page, meaning the best writing is when we are emotionally honest and open. So the imagery of my veins of pitch black ink is a powerful one, where I can picture her emotionally open, bleeding directly into the lyrics of these songs. Finally, she ends with line 58, all's fair in love and poetry, sincerely, the chairman of the Torture Poets Department. This calls to mind the saying, all's fair in love and war, meaning there are no rules here. Everything, all her writing, is all fair game. But for her, it's not for the sake of war. It's not to be petty or to start drama, but for the sake of poetry, her art. So now that we've read the poem, we can listen to the songs on the album with the right context. And that is, the Torture Poets Department is mainly about two things. One, the process of Taylor grieving the end of a 6-year relationship and moving on, with a rebound relationship being a part of that. And two, her feelings about how the public responded to these series of events. So that's it for the poem. Let me know which songs you want me to talk about.